So let's talk about Washington. Now, of course, we talked about the Constitutional Convention last time. Everybody was pretty sure that Washington was going to be uh, the first president. Everybody knew that was going to be the case, um, that Washington would be the first president. They were always very careful about who was going to be the president, who was going to be speaking. And so Washington gets all the electoral college votes, right? Only president to do so. As his vice president, they choose John Adams. John Adams, of course, uh, as Jefferson called Adams one time, he called him the Atlas of the Revolution, that he really led the debates in getting America to adopt the Declaration of Independence. He'd been the ambassador to Great Britain. So Adams is going to be the vice president. Now, so the first thing to do, Washington has to get people to serve. And so he doesn't have a large government at the time. And so he's going to have about four positions. One is going to be the Secretary of State, and that's going to go to Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson had been in France. He's considered one of America's most experienced diplomats, obviously. And this is going to be important to note, is that starting with Jefferson, it's going to be that people are going to look at being Secretary of State as the stepping stone to becoming president, because Jefferson, Secretary of State, becomes president. Madison was Secretary of State, becomes president, and Monroe, Secretary of State, becomes president. That plays a little factor later on. So Jefferson is the Secretary of State. Alexander Hamilton, the brilliant Alexander Hamilton, so brilliant at the Constitutional Convention, a person that Washington trusts implicitly, is going to be the Secretary of the Treasury. Your first Attorney General is Edmund Randolph, and the first Secretary of War. And by the way, it is Secretary of War until about 1947, when we changed the title to Secretary of Defense. And that's probably because war sounded a little bit too aggressive, and so defense sounds better. So there you go. There's some political correctness, if you want to call it that, back in 1947. And that's going to be Henry Knox. Knox was a bookseller in Boston, who became one of also Washington's indispensable people. And so he's going to be in charge of the Army. Not a lot to do there. About 172 people in the Army. So really not a lot of people to run for Henry Knox. Now, what Washington does with these four people, he says, you know what? We should probably meet on a regular basis. All of us meet together in one room and talk about the issues. Well, what does that mean then? That means what Washington has just now done, he's created the presidential cabinet. The cabinet does not exist in the Constitution, nowhere. And so Washington has already started forming the US government that we know today. Now, I should point out, when Washington is sworn in, he adds the "So help me God," which was not in the Constitution. Washington also added that in to the American lexicography. Well, so they're going to meet on a regular basis, Washington and his four cabinet members. He doesn't invite John Adams. John Adams, as vice president, his job is to preside over the Senate and break ties. Now, you know today that the vice president can't enter in debate. That's probably because of John Adams. That's not a constitutional thing, but Adams wouldn't shut up in the Senate. And so finally, the Senate changed the rules to say the vice president can't enter in debate. So thank you, John Adams, for that. And part of it was because there was a big debate early on what do you call the president? Adams had his majestic royalness or highness, the president and defender of the president of these United States. It was finally Washington who pretty much told Adams, just call me Mr. President. And that's what we do today. Again, another George Washington creation. So what is Washington going to do as presidency, for his presidency? Well, the first thing we have a problem is when they created this Constitution, they didn't see the idea of political parties happening. They just didn't think that was going to happen. You wouldn't have political parties, that people would just sort of come together and agree on issues. But early on, you started seeing factions, and that's how they would call parties at the time, your faction. And it's mainly two groups. One we become known as the Federalist, or sometimes known as the Hamiltonians, because they're led by, obviously, Alexander Hamilton. The other is going to be called the Democratic Republicans, or sometimes called the Jeffersonians, because they're led by Thomas Jefferson. So why do we end up having parties when they didn't expect us to have parties? Well, I'm going to boil this down real simply. When we talk about the origins of parties, the reason we have parties is because they're going to argue over two questions. And believe it or not, it's the same two questions that we argue over today. It hasn't changed. And the two questions are this. Number one, what's the meaning of the Constitution? Okay. And number two, what's the role of the government? That's what we argue about today. No difference. That's it in a nutshell. Is it the government's job to do healthcare, or is it the government's job to do education? What does the Constitution mean when it says no unreasonable search and seizures? What does it mean when it says the government can do all things necessary and proper? These are the debates that really created these parties. So let's take a quick look at each position here. So for the Federalist, number one, they believed in a strong central government. Hamilton was a big proponent of a strong central government. Didn't trust the states. The Jeffersonians believed in more power to state governments. The Federalists, they believed in the United States being a manufacturing economy. Hamilton believed that the great powers of the world were manufacturing powers, right? Great Britain, those people, these the way to make America strong was to have a strong manufacturing base. Now, the Jeffersonians, or the Democratic Republicans, said no. They said, look, if you looked at the corrupt powers of the world, they are the manufacturing powers. You go to Great Britain, you've got slums, people living in just abject poverty. You've got debtor's prison. No, we don't want to do that. In fact, Jefferson said that being an agrarian society, an agricultural society, was the way to go. He said that there was nothing more noble than a man working the land, or in his case, enslaving other people to work the land for him, obviously. Now, the reason for Jefferson's position and the Democratic Republicans was because if you lived in the city, or if you became industrialized, you couldn't feed yourself. At least farmers could always feed themselves. And so they saw farming as really the most noble thing you could do. All right, so back to the Hamiltonians, or the Federalists. They believed in a loose interpretation of the Constitution. In other words, the Constitution gave the government more powers than are just listed there. And we'll come back to that in a minute. The Democratic Republicans, or the Jeffersonians, believed in a strict interpretation of the Constitution, that you could only do what was in the Constitution, nothing more, nothing less. I just want to give you a heads up. When Jefferson becomes president, he flips on this issue and believes that he has a lot more power than is actually listed in the Constitution. The Hamiltonians, or Federalists, they believed in close ties with Great Britain. They liked the idea of law and order, not the TV show, but the British unwritten Constitution, this law and order system they had there, they liked that. The Jeffersonians, or Democratic Republicans, preferred closer ties with France. This idea of liberty, equality, and fraternity. They believed that was the way to go. And that's not surprising. Jefferson was a bit of a Francophile, right? He had spent a lot of time in France, really enjoyed France. And so they believed in closer ties with France. Of course, France was America's first ally in the Revolutionary War. The Hamiltonians, or Federalists, believed in high voting qualifications. They said, look, we just can't have anybody voting. That would be a disaster. There really should only be landowning white men voting. That's all that should be voting. Now, because they didn't trust the masses. Now, the Jeffersonians, or again, the Democratic Republicans, believed, no, we need to loosen those qualifications. Now, when I say loosen those qualifications, it doesn't mean allowing women to vote or minorities to vote. It just means allowing more white men to vote. And so when I ask people about this, and I say, whose ideas went out over the long haul? Well, it's clearly Alexander Hamilton's, right? manufacturing base, close ties with Great Britain, a loose interpretation of the Constitution. The only thing they miss out on is the high voting qualifications. It's one of the reasons why when you look at US currency, you've got two non-US presidents on the US currency. One of them is, of course, Benjamin Franklin, and the other one's Alexander Hamilton. His impact on America can't be understated. So let's see how this works out. Now, Hamilton is going to clash with Jefferson because Hamilton's going to issue this report and recommendation to George Washington about the state of the United States economically, his report on manufacturing. And what Hamilton's going to suggest in this short time period where he's going to clash with Jefferson is a couple of things. He said, first off, we should start moving to becoming a manufacturing country so we don't have to worry about imports. And that means adding a protective tariff. All right, so there goes you laissez-faire people who think that the government's always been laissez-faire. You're putting a tariff, the government's putting a tariff or tax on import in order to force Americans to buy American-made products, which were often more expensive than imported goods. The British, for example, had already mastered a lot of this. They could produce things cheaply. American goods were slow to get around, and they would have to make them more expensive. And this is important to note. This tariff issue is going to be somewhat controversial with the southern states. And the reason is because the manufacturing interests are all in the North, right? Not in the South. They're not into manufacturing. They think that's a dirty business. And so it seems like this tariff is really just protecting Northern manufacturers. That's what it's doing. In other words, everybody's having to pay more to benefit one section of the country. So he wants this tariff. And then the other thing that he wants to do is that he says, look, we know that states had debts from the war, and a lot of these states can't pay off their debt. Now, some states had, Virginia had, but other states hadn't. They still had this big debt. So Hamilton believed that what we should do is have the federal government assume their debt. So, okay, look, we're going to take over your debt. Now, why would the federal government do that? Because Hamilton argued that the federal government needed to establish that it could take on debt and pay debt to establish credit with other countries. Now, of course, if you were a southern state or another state that had paid off your debt, you go, wait, why are we paying off somebody else's debt? And so there's going to be some resistance to that idea. And then one of Hamilton's big ideas is that he says, what we need to do is we need to create a national bank. Why a bank? Well, the idea of the bank is that the bank would be a place for the government to hold its money and then also loan money out as a way of stimulating businesses. You could loan money to businesses to get started and operate. And this is a good idea, he thinks. Well, the problem with the national bank is nowhere in the Constitution does it say you can create a national bank. And Washington points out, goes, well, it's a good idea, but where can we do this? Well, Hamilton says, look, it says in the Constitution that the federal government can coin money and regulate its value. Well, then that begs the question, how do you regulate the value of money? Well, you regulate the value of money by how much money is in circulation at a particular time. The more money is in circulation, the less it's worth, right? It's why we can't print $23 trillion and pay off our national debt. It'd become worthless, right? I always give the example and we'll talk about this much, much later. In 1906, $1 would buy 5 Deutschmarks in Germany. In 1923, $1 would buy 14 trillion Deutschmarks because of runaway inflation. So by how much money you have in the money supply can regulate the value of money. Makes sense. Well, okay, so the government says in the Constitution it can regulate the value of money, but it doesn't say how. How can they control the amount of money in the money supply? Well, Hamilton says you do that by a bank, right? So the bank would be able to loan out money that would be increasing the amount of money in circulation, or it could raise interest rates, thus limiting the amount of money in circulation. But where would the government get the power to create a bank? It just says it can regulate its value. Hamilton says, look, if you look in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, it empowers the government to do all things necessary and proper to carry out its delegated function. Now, in government parlance, we call that the necessary and proper clause, or sometimes cleverly the elastic clause, because it stretches the power of the government. And so Hamilton argues to Washington, he says, look, it says in the Constitution that we have a power, and that power is to coin money and regulate its value. But it also says in the Constitution, we can do all things necessary and proper to carry out that function. And so you can create a national bank, which is necessary and proper in Hamilton's eyes, to regulate the value of money. Washington buys that. Now, I don't mean buy it as it's not a good argument. I mean, when you think about the power to raise an army, well, how do you do that? You say a draft. Well, it doesn't say anything about a draft in the Constitution, but it's necessary and proper to have a draft. So selling it to Washington's one thing, but getting it through Congress and the Democratic Republicans, including Jefferson and Madison, is another. Now, if you've seen the musical Hamilton, where they talk in the room where it happens, apparently Hamilton, Madison, and Jefferson met, and they made a deal. The deal is, hey, we'll accept these plans, but we know we're going to build a new nation's capital, and we want that capital to be located in the South, because they're meeting in New York City right now. And so they go, so Hamilton said, look, I don't care where the capital's built. And so that's the deal. That's why Washington, D.C. straddles Maryland and Virginia, and is actually built on old swampland. If you've been to Washington, there's a rail stop called Foggy Bottom. It's actually a swamp, strangely enough. And so they make that deal. All right. So now we're going to build this bank, and we're assuming states' debts. We're going to try to have a tariff. But we've assumed these states' debts. So how do we pay off these debts is the next question. Well, Hamilton comes up with an idea, a tax on hard liquor, whiskey. This would be so-called whiskey tax. Well, the whiskey tax is not a popular tax. And the reason is that most Americans had stills back in the day. There was a lot of alcohol. And so here's how it would work. If you were a farmer, let's say you were in Pennsylvania, and you had a mule, and you would say, look, I've got this rye, for example, and I'm going to take it to be to the mill to be ground up into flour. Well, a mule could carry 2 bushels of rye, 2 bushels, and that's it. But if you had a still and you took that rye and you made it into whiskey, a mule could carry 2 barrels of whiskey, which is about 24 bushels of rye. So by converting your grain into alcohol, you would be able to ship more of it to market at a cheaper rate. And so most people were selling a lot of whiskey. So when this whiskey tax comes about, it's not very popular, especially in Pennsylvania, in Western Pennsylvania. And so farmers there have a revolt. They arm themselves, they create a ragtag army. Well, Washington says, no, this is not going to stand. Washington raises an army and leads it himself into Western Pennsylvania. Now, you imagine that today. If would you think that any president of the United States would raise their own army and go out and after somebody? Probably not. But Washington could, because he's George Washington. Now, the rebellion fades away for the most part. But what it does demonstrate is that Washington is saying, look, this isn't like it used to be where you just revolt because you don't like something. This is a national government. We make laws. These are your elected representatives, and we're going to enforce those laws. This isn't going to be mob rule. And so Washington demonstrates the power of the national government. Now, foreign policy is going to be a little bit trickier for Washington. And the first part of that is because of the French Revolution. The French had gone heavily into debt, supporting America. And so now they had a revolution against the king. Now, at first, people in America, like Jefferson, was very happy about this. They said, great, it's a revolution, it's democracy spreading, it's getting rid of the aristocracy. But as you know, that French Revolution gets out of hand with the so-called Reign of Terror. Now, you know that's bad, right? You really don't want a reign of terror. You want sort of a snowfall of bunnies, but not a reign of terror, because soon with a new type of instrument, the guillotine, which was a much more humane way, I guess, of chopping off people's head. By the way, I think they were guillotining people until the 1970s. Almost everybody could stand trial as a traitor very quickly. Of course, they chop off the king's head. I have a real interesting article about that, saying that they felt like they had to chop off the king to get away from an aristocracy, because even if you exiled the king, he's still the king. Only by killing the king could you break free. Up to 1976, they were guillotining people. So they had to kill him. So this becomes a very nasty revolution. One moment you're a hero, and the next minute you're getting your head chopped off. So this disturbed the British, right? The British are thinking, oh, this is not good. If we start seeing revolutions overthrowing kings, that's a terrible idea. In fact, if you've ever read the book, The Scarlet Pimpernel, right? It's the idea that there's this superhero novel, really, this British nobleman who sneaks into France and sneaks noblemen out of France. They go to war with France, right? So Britain and France are at war. Well, according to the treaty that the United States signed with France back in 1778, after the Battle of Saratoga, the United States was obligated to come to France's aid. That's what the treaty said. You've got to come to France's aid. Well, Washington is well aware of his treaty obligations, obviously. And he says, well, let's see, we've got 172 people in the army. We've got really no navy to speak of, and we're not economically strong. And so he pretty much tells France, look, France, I know what the treaty says. I know it says we're obligated to do so, but we're not going to do so. We're going to stay neutral. Well, of course, the French aren't happy about that, but they send an ambassador over to the United States. And his name is Edmund Genet, and this becomes known as the Citizen Genet affair. Now, remember, the capital's in New York. Genet lands in South Carolina. That's a little bit further south in New York than you would suspect, right? But what he's doing is he's going to make his way up the coast, and he's offering to pay people to become privateers. A privateer is a pirate, but employed by the government, right? And so he said, look, if you'll arm yourselves, you can have safe passage into French ports and unload. And then he's trying to also rally sort of frontiersmen to go attack other parts of Great Britain. We can get people out there in the West and get them out there attacking. So in other words, he's trying to draw America into the war. Well, Washington's angry about this. Even Jefferson, who's a big Francophile, is embarrassed by this. And Washington declares Genet persona non grata. Well, what persona non grata means is that you got to get out of the country. You're being kicked out. So now normally you'd say, well, was that a big deal to Edmund Genet? He got kicked out of the country. Well, almost at the same time, he gets called back to France to stand trial for charges. Well, as you know, that was not sounding good to Edmund Genet. He knew what that meant. That usually meant you go back, you stand trial before a tribunal, and then shortly afterwards, you get your head chopped off. So as you can imagine, Genet is in a panic, and he begs to be allowed to stay. And Washington is nice enough to allow him to stay, where he eventually marries an American woman. And I believe it's his grandson, Edmund Genet III, who serves, he's one of the first waves of troops going back to France in World War I, where he is subsequently killed. And by the way, if you're wondering why it's called Citizen Genet, is that in France, that was the highest title you could give somebody at the time after the revolution, was that you were a citizen. You actually belonged to something, right? belong to a country. It's often why the French Revolution is considered a real revolution as opposed to the American Revolution, which sort of kept the status quo. In France, they really instituted ideas of nationalism and ideology that were dramatically impactful throughout Europe for the rest of the up until today, really. So now Washington is going to run for a second term. He's not real keen on running for a second term. He's tired of the fighting between Hamilton and Jefferson and that group, but he runs. And by the way, one of the things that Washington really gets bothered by is the press. Every president complains about them because the press, certain elements of the press are now calling him a dictator and a tyrant. Even Tom Paine, I think I told you, wrote a tract calling Washington a tyrant until he needed Washington's help to get out of a French jail. Now, the last thing we really want to talk about with Washington's presidency is Jay's Treaty. John Jay is the Supreme Court Justice of the United States. Now, you're saying, why is this a treaty with John Jay? Well, because for the first decade of the Supreme Court, there really wasn't much to do. You didn't have a lot of cases moving up. What you think of the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court today is vastly different than it was back then. And so often they would send the Chief Justice on some diplomatic missions. Now, John Jay was sent to England. And the issue was that the British had promised to get out of what we call the Northwest Territory at the time. That Northwest Territory are places like Ohio, Michigan. That's their Northwest Territory, Wisconsin. And the British haven't left. They still have forts there. And so Washington is sending Jay over to negotiate to get the British to leave. And he also wants, from the British, he wants compensation for the slaves that the British had freed during the Revolutionary War. Slave owners want compensation. And the Americans want access to the West Indies. They want to be able to trade with the West Indies. That was some of their most lucrative trading deals that they had, was out of the West Indies, and Washington knew that would increase Americans' economy. Sorry, my dog's scratching at the door and he distracts me occasionally. So Jay goes over there and the British make him wait, because really, what does he have to offer that the British really need? They don't need that trade. They can sit in the forts and the Americans really can't do anything. And they're not interested really in paying compensation for slaves that were freed. They don't care. So he waits and waits. And finally, the British come back with a deal. And they said, look, here's the deal. We'll leave the forts by 1796. But we're not going to give you any compensation for freed slaves, nor are we going to give you trade access to the West Indies, but you're going to help us recover debts that are owed to British merchants. A lot of Americans had owed debts to British merchants, and after the war, they go, well, we're not going to pay those. And the British says, you're going to help us get those collected. And so Jay does agree with that. It's a very unpopular treaty. In fact, Jay makes the remarks that when he sails back into the United States, he could see himself, he could see the coastline lit up as people are burning him in effigy. And the Senate will approve the treaty in a very closed session meeting where Washington himself will go to the Senate and argue for the passage of the treaty. Think about that. How often does a president really go into the Senate and argue for a treaty? But he does get it done. So Washington is coming up on 1796. He served 2 terms. And of course, the Constitution says he could run as long as he wanted to, and he probably could have been president as long as he wanted to. But Washington says, you know what? I think 2 terms is enough. Now, Washington's setting another trend, right? That nobody will want to serve more than 2 terms, because when you try to, people would say, who are you? Washington said only 2 terms. Why do you think you could run for 3? And it wasn't until Franklin Roosevelt, 150 years later, decided he goes on, Franklin Roosevelt, I'm going to run for a 3rd term. So Washington's going to give a farewell address. Now, it's not spoken because Washington, didn't have really good teeth. And he also wasn't a real great public speaker at this age. It's printed. And to sum it up, pretty much what Washington says was, he says, look, one, he says, you need to beware of entangling alliances, permanent alliances that keep you trapped into having to come to people's defense. And he was referring to that French treaty. He said, temporary alliances are okay, that's fine, but you should never be committed to anything that you cannot get out of. Two, he said, beware factions and factionalism. What he means is political parties. He saw the destructive parts of factionalism and didn't like it. And three, he says, beware sectionalism, right? This North versus South. Sectionalism was destructive. And so he probably would have said what the country needed was a little bit of sectional healing. A little Marvin Gaye there for you. Okay, never mind. Forget that. It was a terrible joke. I won't say it again. Anyway, and so Washington goes home and says, hey, my family dies. I'll probably just go home and die, as he said in 1783. So that means that we're going to have our first contested presidential race in 1796, the first one with parties. Now, for the Democratic Republicans, obviously, you're going to choose your leader, Thomas Jefferson, to be your candidate. And and by the way, as his running mate, if that was the case, it's not as like you think it is today, would have been Aaron Burr. For the Federalist, you would think, why not Alexander Hamilton? Well, one, as we said in the last lecture, a lot of people hated Hamilton because he was arrogant, thought he knew better than everybody else, and often probably did. But he'd also been caught having an affair with a young woman and paying her bribes, and there was a paper trail. So no Hamilton. So it's going to be John Adams. John Adams and Thomas Pinckney are the candidates. Now, the way the Constitution is written at this time, it said whoever got the majority of the Electoral College votes became the president, but whoever got the second most became the vice president. Well, Hamilton doesn't like Adams, and he doesn't like Jefferson either. Hamilton's got a lot of hate in him for some reason. He doesn't like a lot of people. Really hates Burr, probably for good reason later on. But Hamilton messes around, and he's trying to get it where Pinckney actually becomes president for the Federalists, not Adams. Well, it doesn't work out that way. And so when the election results come in, Adams has the most Electoral College votes, and Thomas Jefferson has the second most. So imagine that today. Imagine, say, tomorrow that, say, Joe Biden wins, and then Trump gets second, and Trump becomes the vice president, or Trump wins and Biden's the vice president. You become, that's crazy. How do they even work together? So that's how it works out, though. Now, a little bit about Adams. Adams is a guy that just, you hear players in football say, well, I don't get the respect I deserve. That's John Adams. He's always felt that way. He always felt that he was always slighted. And there's reasons for that. I mean, he went to Harvard, and even though he had better grades than, say, Thomas Sewell, who came from a more prominent family, Sewell was ranked higher from him because he came from a prominent family. And so Adams always believed in this meritocracy, and that he was never given his due. In fact, even after the Constitution, he said, look, they're going to remember Jefferson, and they're going to remember Franklin and Washington, and I'll be left in the dustbin of history, which essentially was until there was a book written by him, John Adams. They based the miniseries off of him. David McCullough wrote it. That's who I was thinking about. David McCullough wrote it and sort of reinvented John Adams. So he was disappeared for a long time. But Adams also had a lot of experience. He'd been vice president. He was known as the Atlas of the Revolution, as Jefferson called him. He had written the Massachusetts Constitution, still in use today. But chip on his shoulder. Well, the Adams presidency is going to be a one-term presidency. And let's just talk about it pretty quickly. The big issue that's going to really face Adams is a war with France. There is a stalemate in this war between Britain and France. Obviously, Britain is dominant on the sea. France is dominant on the land. So there's a stalemate. And that both the British and the French navies were seizing American merchant ships. And so there were Americans in Adams' own party, the Federalist Party, who wanted war with France. Now, Adams wanted to avoid this much as Washington did. In fact, what he comes up to right after the election, he goes to Jefferson and he says, I know we were best friends, we were best buds during the Declaration of Independence, that time period, that spirit of 76, as he called it. And then we had a falling out, which they did during the Washington presidency. And he says, but I'll tell you what, let's operate as co-presidents. Let's reunite the spirit of 76 and we'll work together as equals in this presidency. And maybe we can solve this French problem. And maybe you could go to France because you're so liked in France to help solve this problem. Well, Jefferson pretty much says, well, let me think about it. And he goes, talks to Madison about it. And pretty much Madison, in a sense, says, screw that. No way. What we should be doing is we should spend every waking moment sabotaging the Adams presidency. So Adams can't really rely on his vice president, who's going to be hiring newspapers and leaking information to those newspapers about Adams, a lot of false information about Adams, and maybe even leaking information to the French government. So Jefferson won't even stay and preside over the Senate. He goes back to Monticello and is operating all these things. And every time Adams tries to call him on it, Jefferson goes, I didn't do that. I didn't do that. Of course, historians now know that he did. We have the records. So Jefferson's going. So Adams goes, okay, here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna send 3 ambassadors over to France to work this out. So he sends 3 ambassadors over. I think it was John Marshall, Elbridge Gerry. I can't forget the last one. But anyway, they also have to wait when they go there. They sit and they wait and they wait and they wait because they really have no leverage either. Well, they're eventually approached by 3 French ministers who Adams will never identify. He will just call them X, Y, and Z. And you may have heard of this before, the XYZ affair. And these 3 French ministers say, look, you want to talk to our foreign minister, Talleyrand, okay. But to do so, we want a $250,000 bribe. Now, before you think, oh my gosh, why would the French do this? This was not an unusual thing to have happen, to bribe your way into an office, standard European sort of diplomacy. Plus, we want a $12 million loan to help us fight our war before we can even talk about the issues. Well, as you can imagine, when the news hits the United States that the French are wanting bribes and they're wanting a loan before we can even talk about it, there's anger. The saying was, millions for defense, but not 1 red cent in tribute. And so Adams is being pushed by his party to go into war. He doesn't want to. He's doing everything to avoid that war. And so the Federalists are calling Adams a pacifist. He's not standing up for America. The Democratic Republicans are calling him a warmonger, that he's just really trying to get a war started. And this enters into what we call the quasi-war. It looks like a war, smells like a war, but it's not a war. Adams is forced to pass a bill to create an army, a 10,000 man strong army, and increase the Navy. Adams is actually known as the father of the US Navy. So he's got to create this army. Now you think about it, and this army, you go, okay, we got an army, where are we going to attack France? Great Britain, France rather, where we're going to attack France is impossible. But he's going to need somebody to lead the army. So who do you get to lead the army? That's right. You go to George Washington. Now, Washington is not really in the mood to do this. He goes, I don't think I want to do it. And Adams goes, well, I'm appealing to your patriotism, sir. Well, dude, right? You can't appeal to George Washington's patriotism. He's done everything you possibly could do. And to sort of play this patriotism card on Washington didn't sit well. But Washington said, okay, look, I'll do it. I'll lead this army. But I get to name my second in command. And now you're probably thinking, yeah, well, what's the big deal? Well, everybody knows that Washington's not going to leave Mount Vernon to actually go command an army in the field. And whoever's going to be commanding that army in the field, if they get into a war, will get all the glory. And he chooses Alexander Hamilton, who Adams hates. They hate each other, and no choice but to accept that deal. Now, of course, there's never war. Cooler heads prevail. Washington is able to again retire in peace and eventually die in 1799. He goes out riding in a cold December night, comes back with a cough, and then his throat starts closing up. They bleed him repeatedly, right? Because this is the time where they believe he had 4 humors, and that if you had a fever, you had too much blood and you had to leak out the blood to do it. They eventually do a real primitive version of a tracheotomy, but to no avail, and Washington is dead. So he does eventually get to die. Now, for Adams, this whole quasi-war with France has been a pain because the newspapers, being paid by Jefferson, have been really ripping him, right? They've said all sorts of terrible things about he's a warmonger, he's a traitor, he's a monarchist, he's a hermaphrodite, they argue that. So if you think the press is bad today, not really, but it's the same. And so he is convinced by the Federalists to pass 2 laws. And these will be known as the Alien and Sedition Acts. Now, the Alien Act extended the time period in which you could become an American citizen. It was 5 years. They made it 14. Why would they do this? Because they knew most immigrants were tending to vote for Jefferson's party. And if you could extend the time period in which they could become citizens, they weren't going to be voting anytime soon. Now, I know Anthony will like this one. The Sedition Act made it a crime to criticize the government, publicly criticize the government. My God, it's our hobby today, right? And you could be thrown in jail for criticizing the government. Well, and of course, this was aimed at Jefferson's party. I mean, they actually throw Ben Franklin's grandson into jail at one point. They threw another man in jail who drew a cartoon of Adams bent over and a cannon aiming at his backside. That's not good. And so they actually throw a lot of people in jail for just criticizing the government. Now, I know what you're saying, Brian. Yeah, that's right. The fever dream of getting up politicians. That's right. You're going to jail, Anthony. Take that. Anyway, you're saying, well, Brian, wait a minute. Freedom of the press, free speech, right? That's protected by the Constitution against the federal government's interference. So this law must be unconstitutional. Okay, so we're in 1799. Who gets to declare what's constitutional, what's not constitutional? Now, before you say, oh, the Supreme Court, find that in the Constitution for me, because you won't, because it doesn't exist there. This idea of judicial review that we know today, the reason we have judicial review is that the Supreme Court will give it to itself in 1803 in the next lecture. But at this time, there was no mechanism really to determine which laws were constitutional or who could declare which laws constitutional or unconstitutional. Well, Jefferson and Madison come up with what they call the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. And this is going to be important to note. In fact, it shows up again. I remember Rick Perry saying that states should be able to nullify Obamacare. All that comes back from this time period right here. Jefferson and Madison argued in the Virginia-Kentucky resolutions that a state could declare a federal law null and void within its jurisdiction, and then that would go to a vote of all the other states. And if 3/4 of the states said, we agree this is not constitutional, then that law would be overturned. Now, imagine doing that today, right? Having these constant state votes on what a federal law is constitutional, what's not. I mean, at one point, do you even have a federal law that means anything? But it was an idea, and this was this idea of nullifying federal laws, and that's why I brought up Rick Perry, but it'll show up again here in about 35 years from this time period in the Adams presidency. But they don't have to do it, and the reason they don't have to do it, they don't have to nullify the law, is because there's an election in 1800, and things change after an election, as we well know.